and welcome. My name is Mariya Ilyas and I'm a Foreign Service Officer currently in Arabic language training. I'll be going to Amman, Jordan for my first tour as Vice Consul. And today I have the privilege of sitting down with the extraordinary, legendary, and one-of-a-kind Ambassador Thomas R. Pickering. Thank you so much for being with me.
Thank you, Mariya, for that very kind introduction.
To many people, Ambassador Pickering is known as a five-star diplomat, but to me, he has proved to be a personal mentor and a role model. I first met Ambassador Pickering in summer of 2016. I was doing an internship at the State Department. The Bowdoin Alumni Office had connected us, and I sat across from him over breakfast, feeling this immense sense of awe and gratitude that he had made time for me and that I was having the opportunity to sit with him. So that feeling, Ambassador, never goes away, so I'm humbled by this opportunity. Thank you again.
Thank you.
I'd like to start with your early life and educational background. You graduated from Bowdoin College in 1953 with a degree in history. What made you want to go to a small liberal arts college in Maine?
Well, I had a real choice between going to Cornell and doing mechanical engineering and going to Bowdoin and do liberal arts, and it was really the opportunity to visit Bowdoin ahead of time that convinced me it was the right place for me.
And from our previous conversations, you had mentioned that you had plans to join the military. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Well, my plans were in fact mainly legislated by the fact that we had to do obligatory military service. So I did 2 years of graduate study before going into the Navy, and had actually looked at the Navy while I was in Boeing, and I looked at flight programs. After 2 years of graduate school, my eyes weren't up to it, so the Navy made me a photo interpreter.
That's amazing. And why did you decide to study history?
I studied history because I thought that it was, for me, one of the most fascinating subjects I dealt with. As a young student in high school and before, I kind of inhabited a local library and was really fascinated by reading books about history. So it came naturally.
That's awesome. And what types of activities were you involved with on campus?
Well, a lot of them. I played a role in my fraternity, which almost everybody did in one way or another.
Which fraternity was that?
I was in Theta Delta Chi. I managed the Glee Club and was also a manager at the Bowdoin Drama Organization.
Oh, nice.
I didn't think I had any scope or talent, either musically or artistically, although in my end of my senior year, I got 5 lines in a play, The Merchant of Venice, at the time of graduation, as kind of honoring me for my service. I was also a manager of the track team at Bowdoin, and so I did a number of things, and they were all enjoyable, and I learned a lot from each of them.
Did you have a favorite dining hall from Moulton or Thorne?
Well, because we all ate in fraternities, we had no choices, but the Moulton Union was then still very good, not nearly as good as it is today.
Did world events at the time affect the climate on campus? We often find college campuses to be hubs for social change or political change.
I think less than they do today, in part because I think that's the influence of social media. But those of us who are interested in the world outside of Bowdoin were interested in what was going on. I remember listening on the radio to the coronation of Queen Elizabeth, for example, that took place, I think, in my last year, or my next to last year. So we were interested in what was going on very clearly, and things were moving. I can remember in 1950 in June, I was in fact running a Boy Scout camp for my old hometown Boy Scout troop when the Korean War broke out, and that certainly had a lot of influence on us.
For sure. So you then went on to earn your master's degree from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. I also graduated from there last May. How did Fletcher prepare you for your career?
I thought enormously well. I took international law with Leo Gross, which always has served me well. Knowing something about international law is both a privilege and a necessity for a diplomat. I took American diplomatic history with Rule Bartlett, who had by then written perhaps the best book on the subject and was outstanding. I took an economics course in world trade with one of the men who was instrumental in negotiating the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, and I took a course in Commonwealth diplomatic history with a gentleman who ran the law school at the University of Melbourne, which attracted me to going to Australia to study. And I had a wonderful course in Far Eastern diplomatic history with a professor from Taiwan who opened up particularly the 18th and 19th century diplomacy in Asia in a way that I had never even heard about, much less thought about before. So for that year at Fletcher was a fascinating opportunity for me.
And you mentioned your study abroad in Australia. It was a Fulbright Scholarship, correct?
I did. I had hoped to go in the State Department. I'd taken the State Department written exam the June after my graduation from Bowdoin in 1953 and passed, but it was Army McCarthy hearings time, which we all watched with avid interest, and the State Department was not taking any people in. I then applied for a Fulbright to Australia because I thought, gee, I've got to fill the time, and it's something to do and I can learn something. By the end of my Fletcher year, just before I left for Australia, I went to Washington and took the oral exam for the State Department. I passed, was offered a job in January, that would have been 1955, at the State Department, and I said, look, I've got to do this and then naval service or some military service. They said, fine, we'll keep you on the register. So it wasn't until June of 1959 that I actually started to serve as a diplomat.
That's amazing. So Ambassador Pickering holds the personal rank of Career Ambassador, which is the highest rank attainable in the U.S. Foreign Service. Your diplomatic career spans 5 decades. You've served as the U.S. Ambassador to the Russian Federation, India, Israel, El Salvador, Nigeria, and the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. From 1989 to 1992, you also served as the ambassador and U.S. representative to the United Nations. And your final assignment with the Department of State was the Undersecretary for Political Affairs from 1997 to 2000, which is the 3rd highest rank within the department. So you've already talked a little bit about the path that led you to the Foreign Service, but what was the constant factor that was pushing you to want to become a diplomat? Why did you want to take the Foreign Service test? What was the appeal?
I thought a lot under the influence of my mother in particular, interestingly enough, that public service was a good career. She actually wanted me to be a minister of religion.
Oh, wow.
And I thought fairly early on I didn't have the calling for that, but I thought public service was something that perhaps had some of the same rewards, which I knew were psychic and not monetary, but nevertheless was interested. And then at Bowdoin, a number of the people under whom I studied encouraged me to look in that direction as well. So I was in fact propelled, if I could put it this way, by this combination of interest to look at the State Department, take the exam, see how I did, and move in that direction. And it worked, and I enjoyed it, and I never looked back, and it was perhaps the wisest decision I made, but also one of the luckiest decisions I made.
So you've had a chance to serve under many administrations, see the department evolve over the years, see new policies implemented. If you had to choose perhaps the top 3 major changes to the State Department, what would you say they are since the time you first started and today?
I think the internal changes to me that perhaps made the most sense was an effort back before the 1970s to look at how to organize and formulate our diplomacy. In the 1970s. It produced a report. It had a very, very seminal influence on how things went that led to the Foreign Service Act of 1980. I suppose before I came in, the Riston Report, which took a State Department which had literally been bifurcated by the Second World War, with the Foreign Service officers serving perpetually overseas, and the Washington jobs occupied increasingly by civil servants, and said in effect that in the end, we needed the professional foreign service and that they should serve both in Washington and overseas, not too long in either place. They should be prepared and able to go anywhere, and I think that was extremely important. And then I would say the third, and you might think this is strange, but I think it was true, the intellectual challenge of somebody like Henry Kissinger, followed perhaps by George Shultz and by others, that we needed to think strategically. We were dealing with a world that had radically changed. We had many obligations as a leading country, and that diplomacy was in the forefront of our national capacity both to survive and prosper, which I think were interesting lessons that many of us took to heart, strove to compile a record to do that equally well, and learned, and constantly learned. And I think one of the great jobs of a diplomat is the experience of constantly learning.
You talked about social media a little bit early on, and some people argue that technology and the spread of information are changing the role of diplomats, that because everyone has mobile technology and access to social media, they're their own reporters. Do you agree that the role and responsibilities of diplomats overseas are changing insofar as they're the eyes and ears on the ground?
I think that we were all eyes and ears on the ground. We just had a slower method of reporting. We tended in those earlier days to compete with the press, which is now, I think, not necessary. And I think at the same time, we had basically slower mechanisms for preparing our reporting and writing. Email has certainly replaced that. I remember in my first assignment in the Foreign Service looking at new technology and reading something about email, and that it would come, and I wondered, well, what does it provide? Well, I quickly learned it provided rapid, complete communication with chosen listeners. So the value of email was the rapidity and indeed the succinctness which you could employ in reporting changing events, particularly those that you had selected which would be meaningful in supplementing press reporting. But at the same time, it meant that put it this way, the regularity and indeed the organizational focus which the State Department had on regular communications tended to disappear. Not everybody who knew did know. I think that's being rectified a bit. But it meant that everything became a bit hit and miss. You could select your listeners rather than address all listeners and have the department system select them for you. And I think that lost a good bit of capacity. I also think it lost a little bit of what we all counted on, was making sure that when we received instructions by State Department cable, they were carefully vetted and approved in the State Department. Part of that change took place when we had phones, and then secure telephones, and then secure email. So that opened the opportunity for real discussion between Washington and people in the field about policy without having an effect to expose that to everybody in Washington or even a select group in highly sensitive matters that was represented by the standard telegram system. So I think the pluses and minuses are not balanced. I think the pluses are much stronger, but to some extent it is important that you have an orderly policy, that you have a policy that in one way or another can represent the sense of government. When I was undersecretary, my staff came to me and said, we think it's a good idea that we send out from your office a cable, which they showed me and which I did some work on, which said to American ambassadors, and went to each American ambassador, and I of course talked to Madeleine Albright, who was the secretary at the time, and she said, yes, send it. And the cable said, look, your people carefully selected, both career and non-career, that you are responsible for presenting the U.S. position to your host government, that you get these instructions that are carefully prepared, often by very capable people, but they're cleared around the government as well, and they're come to you in the form of talking points. And the cable said, you should feel free to make your own talking points, particularly because you know the country better than anybody. That's what we're paying you there for. And you and your team can best decide how the objective of the cable can be carried out in your instructions. And since some of these were written for 190 countries, it was obviously necessary to tailor what you were doing with what you did. Well, this in an interesting way represented what career people were doing anyway. We all knew that.
Right.
They weren't following slavishly the talking points, but they were in fact using the talking points to move. And the cable that we sent out said you can change all the talking points you want, but you can't change the policy. And I lost on the next steps. I wanted to change our system of providing talking points by adding to it a short paragraph at the beginning of each cable of talking points explaining exactly what the policy was. And I never succeeded, in part because many people didn't want to relitigate the policy in every telegram. And in other times, at least the talking points carried an implication, if not a direct statement of what the policy was. But I think the best system, in my view, would have been said, here's the policy, you know your country, here are some of the things you should think about in terms of the policy, go and do your job and sell the policy.
Right. So in addition to your ambassadorships, you've had many roles within the State Department as well. And one particular assignment that caught my attention was your role as Assistant Secretary of State of Oceans and International Environmental and Scientific Affairs from 1978 to 1981. What does this bureau do?
This bureau, when I ran it, covered a big waterfront. It was created just a few years before I became the Assistant Secretary by Henry Kissinger, who took a large number of special assistants to the Secretary and combined them in a bureau that was linked together essentially by science-dominated subjects of foreign policy. And so in those days, environment was just beginning to come up. It's become perhaps more in a Bureau of Environmental Affairs than it was in my day. But we covered, for example, a wide range of scientific agreements which the American domestic agencies had with foreign countries, and we oversaw the foreign policy significance of those. We covered nuclear non-proliferation, both as a subject for negotiation and particularly the whole business of selling new U.S. nuclear reactors abroad and some of those implications. We had a section that dealt with population and population problems. We had sections that dealt with health issues and how and in what way they affected our national activity. So it was an absolutely fascinating job. I knew little about it. I'd been ambassador in Jordan. I expected to come back perhaps and work in the Near East Bureau. Disappointed I wasn't asked to do that. Secretary Vance asked me to do this job. I wrote him back and I said, I really thought that I'd be more of use, having had all this experience in the Middle East at the time, in the Middle East. And he wrote back, said, I need you in this bureau and I want you to serve there. And I wrote him back and I said, terrific, but I know Washington and I will not be darkening your doorstep frequently with problems. And I didn't. I was a free agent in many ways.
That's amazing.
To cover a wide range of functional issues. I worked closely with a number of regional bureaus. Non-proliferation had become an even more demanding subject after the Indian nuclear test in 1974. There was new legislation. I spent a great deal of my time dealing with that. It was an absolutely fascinating subject. We had 4 centers in the State Department dealing with non-proliferation. And I really took the business of the daily work with countries like Pakistan and India, Brazil, Argentina, Japan, and Gerard Smith, who had run the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency, did high-level negotiations. I had with me a very close colleague from the Arms Control Agency who joined me for all of my regular meetings, and so we glued the two of us together in that regard. And we had the wonderful Joseph Nye from Harvard.
That's right.
And Joe had actually rented my house when I was in Jordan. I kicked him out.
You told me that when
He went across the street and rented another guy's house whom I had worked for. We all lived in the same area. And Joe and I carpooled for a year, and I learned an inestimable amount from Joe, particularly on the nuclear issues, which he was very much worked closely with. And he, in some ways, was sort of in my chain of command and I in his. He was, in a sense, the chief assistant to the then Undersecretary of State for Science and Technology, but covered a wide range of questions. And Joe was a superb teacher, a really wonderful guy, and someone from whom, of course, I learned a tremendous amount.
I was very lucky that I took his very last class that he
Yeah.
taught at Harvard on the morals of American foreign policy.
Yeah.
And he's an incredible
He is.
academic.
He's an
and
incredible
individual.
guy, yeah.
And it was so funny because my first office hours with him, I
Yeah.
was telling him
Yeah.
about my journey and
Yeah.
having been a Pickering Fellow,
Yeah.
and he told me the exact same thing that he had learned from me.
We're both telling you the truth.
Yeah, now it's confirmed. That's awesome.
Yeah.
So, you mentioned the kind of the importance of nuclear non-proliferation, especially as it relates to the environment. One region of the world that I'm particularly interested in is South Asia. Just a couple weeks ago, we saw both India and Pakistan, two nuclear countries on the brink of war yet again. And so, with the hypertension that exists on the subcontinent, from your experience of having worked on these issues, and also just kind of the future state of affairs there, what do you see as a potential solution in the region,
Well,
either for Kashmir or easing diplomatic relations between the two countries?
Well, interestingly enough, and I've just come from a meeting in Europe in which I met with two very prominent South Asian experts in this area, and we had a little discussion in a broader meeting of Kashmir and what to do about it. And I had not only all of the work I did in the Bureau of Oceans International Environment and Scientific Affairs on non-proliferation, but some previous work I did as Deputy Director of the Bureau of Political Military Affairs on the same subject matter, and then subsequently as Ambassador to India.
Oh wow! Okay. I would imagine to the UN maybe as well. Or?
Sure, and at the UN, and then my son-in-law was political counselor in Pakistan.
Oh wow! Okay.
So we used to trade notes and talk to each other. He was not there at the same time that I was, but at the end, I thought that it was extremely important for India and Pakistan to deal with Kashmir, and I put some thoughts together with the help of my son-in-law back in the 1990s, which at one point or another, because I was very close friends through him, interestingly enough, with a very distinguished ambassador of Pakistan here in town, and passed on some thoughts, which he passed on to President Musharraf, and some of those, not necessarily totally of my origin, appeared in an effort that came very close to success. So I've continued to be very much interested in Kashmir. I think that Kashmir has to be dealt with by India and Pakistan jointly as a autonomous area, that the line of control needs to be emptied of political meaning, and that perhaps the two pieces of Kashmir could be then joined for governance and legislative purposes. I had the kind of crazy idea, but I still think it should work, that that means that the Kashmir that joins together should have the opportunity to be a state of both India and Pakistan, with all that that implies in terms of citizenship and other questions. That could force India and Pakistan, because of trade issues, to have a customs union at least, and that Kashmiris would be responsible for security, and that the military influence on both sides would be entirely neutralized. You could see all kinds of useful ways to proceed. Condominiums have not fared well in the past. On the other hand, it is the absolute necessity to have full autonomy for Kashmir that, in my view, would push this ahead of things like Anglo-Egyptian Sudan in history. And if the two could come together, they would both be winners in this process. I would certainly recognize that the long-occupied portion of northern Kashmir by Pakistan, called Baltistan by many people, would be part of Pakistan, and that in return, India would be given the right to have a referendum in Ladakh and in Jammu for decision by the people of those two areas as to whether they wanted to become states of India. So that the end Kashmir would be mainly the Muslim area surrounding Srinagar and Azad Kashmir on the Pakistan side, which I think would reduce it to proportions that would help to make it a more viable state of both countries.
Last spring, I went to Moscow and St. Petersburg with a trip with the Fletcher School, and we had this incredible opportunity to work jointly with MGMO students on two issues. I was on the cybersecurity team, and some of my colleagues worked on the North Korean peninsula. What was so fascinating to me was how vastly different sometimes the perspectives can be, even though the interests are the same. From your time having served as ambassador to Russia and having lived in the country, what would you say how do the Russians see, their role in world affairs? And also on the question of cybersecurity, do you see that as more and more of a probability of the virtual space as an area where we will be having to do more diplomacy or warfare?
Well, both are really trenchant and important questions. I was in Russia from May of 1993 to the end of November 1996. It was a time when President Yeltsin was in charge, that our relationship was a more open relationship, but the Russians were seriously hurting. The food situation was disastrously bad. They were beginning to try to pick up the pieces after the collapse of communism a year and a half before. Questions of trade were very tight. Then former Soviet economy had kind of diminished to the size of Hungary. And people had multiple jobs, were able to stay alive, living on shoestrings. Almost everybody I dealt with in the month that I arrived was a former communist that lived under communism and hadn't changed their outlook. When I left, a number had shifted. I had the particularly important and useful job of working very closely with Strobe Talbot here, who at that point was both deputy secretary and running the former Soviet Union as a separate kind of bureau without the name of the bureau. But we had a lot to do with how and in what way we could try to introduce ideas. Larry Summers at Treasury, who was then moving up to become Secretary of the Treasury, had spent a lot of his time thinking about Russia. A lot of people were in one way or another engaged in how can Russia develop economically. And at the same time, we had no sovereign answers. Polish economist Adam Michnik once said that going from capitalism to communism was like making fish soup out of a fishbowl, but we didn't know how to reverse the effort. We couldn't put fish back in the bowl. So that meant that there was a real struggle, and that particular period has come in for historical reflection and re-reflection a number of times. It was not as terrible as the pessimists like to portray it. It was not nearly as good as the optimists would hope that it might become. I was there near the end of Yeltsin's kind of heart operation turn, and he survived that, and then I left. And so we were in a position where we had more of Yeltsin and then Putin, and Putin made some very serious changes in Russia and the outlook. But Russia at that point lamented its inability to become a major player on the world scene, although President Clinton worked hard to treat Yeltsin as if he was a significant player. He made Russia a member of the G7 and the G8, treated him, I thought, politely and well on many bilateral meetings and many of the multilateral meetings. But it was clear as well that Russia's capacity to punch up to its own weight was not really there. On cyber and cyber issues, they've of course evolved immensely since the time that I was there. Cyber questions are like a lot of issues. If they are open for foreign management by a combination of both covert intelligence and overt direct plays, it is hard to believe that countries will shy away from exploiting them. That's part of the reality of the international community. And until countries feel that overexploitation in a very narrow nationalistic way will harm them as much as it's harming somebody else, they will continue to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And so we have the development of an interesting parallel. We just talked about Joe Nye. Joe's written about this.
Mm-hmm.
I've thought a lot about it. And it is, in fact, the damage that manipulation of cyber by outside players can do to a country and its economy in particular, so serious that it rivals to some extent what, in fact, an exchange of nuclear weapons would do. And therefore, should we begin to move down the track of saying we can do to you what you can do to us, does deterrence work, and is it something we should pay attention to? Because the reckless destruction in a wide-ranging way of major economies and beyond by cyber intrusion is not in anybody's interest.
Mm-hmm.
And so can you develop also a system in which you can protect your own cyber environment while exploiting your ability to damage somebody else's? And those are the key questions that have to be answered. They have not been answered, but they're very important to look at, because I would strongly favor, as we develop increasing capability in this area, of an approach of mutual respect rather than mutual destruction.
Okay. And the last couple of questions I have are about the fellowship program. So there's a fellowship, a congressionally mandated fellowship named endowed in your name. For those unfamiliar with the program, the Thomas R. Pickering Graduate Foreign Affairs Fellowship is funded by the U.S. Department of State, and it prepares young people for careers in the Foreign Service. I'm a proud Pickering Fellow myself, and I really would not have been able to achieve my dream of serving my country as a diplomat had it not been for the financial support, the mentorship, and the training that this fellowship program provides. So the fellowship was established in 1992, and one of the core principles is diversity. Diversity is a strength in our diplomatic efforts. I know you're very passionate about this topic. I know you've spoken about it as well. In a May 18, 2015 Washington Post article titled, "The Foreign Service is too white, we'd know we're top diplomats," you and Ambassador Edward Perkins talk about the need for greater diversity in the State Department. So why is diversity important in the State Department, and what compelled you to speak out about it, in addition to having the program exist for almost 20 years now?
Well, I think it goes without saying almost that any successful foreign policy has to be reflective of national interest. And national interest is not the captive of a few bright people. It is in many ways also something that has to be part of our national ethic, and how various Americans of various backgrounds, education, experience, and cultural traditions look at foreign policy is an important ingredient in the confection of a foreign policy that meets two tests. One, that it supports our national interest on judgments about priorities. And Harry Truman said once that those were survival and prosperity, and I think he's probably right, while at the same time it had to appeal to the American public. The American public had to, in general, be satisfied that we were aiming our foreign policy, the president was doing this, and the Congress was supporting it in the right direction. So I think bringing in wider diversity in the State Department is very important. When I went into the State Department, the complaint was it was too much Harvard and Yale, or Princeton.
What's the expression? Male
and Yale. Sure. And so we worked hard to diversify in that direction, and people from all over the country came in. But it became obvious very clearly, well before 1992, that minority representation in American foreign policy was an enormous advantage. People had language skills, people had different backgrounds, people had different appreciation of various portions of the world, people had different appreciation of how they grew up in the United States. And I felt very strongly about this, and I thought it was an extremely valuable contribution that by 1992, and my friend Ed Perkins played a serious role in doing this, we started what was clearly a State Department ROTC program, which became, in a sense, a program that would help educate people from diverse backgrounds and bring them into the State Department. By mid-1990s, that sort of was undone by a Supreme Court decision in a Michigan law school case that said we could not apply, in a sense, standards of selection that discriminated in one way or another against anyone else. But we then applied the standard of selection of need. And I think that helped to maintain the program as a diversity program. I left the State Department in early January 2001 and went to work for the Bowdoin Company. I had no contact with the department, I wasn't supposed to. And it wasn't until probably March or April that I found that this program had been named for me. So nobody asked me, nobody told me. It was a gift, and it was in many ways a very nice gift, even if I wasn't informed about it. And in many ways I've enjoyed it. I've always said, however, any gift of this sort, where you name a program for somebody still living, you have to accept the burden of the fact that the person may not live up to the program. So I've worked hard to try to do it. And one of the joys I have is being able to meet new people when they come in the program, talk to them, and give them a sense of how and in what way I see what it is they're undertaking to do for the country, how important it is, how useful it should be to them, how stimulating and interesting it is, and how much it is a demand for persistence, patience, and courage, because no part of life is easy or smooth sailing. And the diplomacy of the United States is not designed to do that. And so you have to accept the burdens as well as the benefits. But I've always felt in my career, and I think subsequently watching others, that the benefits have far outweighed the burdens.
And my final question for you, Ambassador, is one that I hope many can take away from, and that is just, what advice do you have for diplomats of the 21st century? As I prepare to go out to Amman as a consular officer, I know that I'm incredibly excited to represent my country and show the world that an immigrant from Pakistan can also represent one of the most powerful countries in the world. So as many folks like myself and others, taking the oath of office, what should they keep in mind?
Well, I think we should first be very proud of you and the others, both in the Pickering program and beyond, who have in fact survived what is a very tough vetting program to become Foreign Service officers. I think secondly, be proud of the fact that we have a foreign service, that it is based on people who will go anywhere, and people who will compete for promotion, people who are not limited by rigidities of bureaucracy and who in many ways undertake to contend with that. But I think for Foreign Service officers, my best advice is quite simple. Learn. Your previous education is only the preliminary. It's only the beginning. That every day you learn something new. That in many ways we can teach you a great deal, and we don't do enough of this about the profession of diplomacy and how to conduct it. But in many ways, all of us, and I think it's true today as it was in the past, learn from the people that we work for and with about how to be both good and bad in diplomacy and how to make it work. It is in many ways a people-centered function. Diplomats and the people they work with are their most important piece of the endeavor that they're engaged in. And so learning to deal with people is very significant. You can in fact do, as someone once said, convince somebody that you want them to go to hell, but it's their own best idea about how to get there. Words to that effect. But in many ways it is true. And you learn a great deal. You learn that listening is not just hearing what the other person says, which is essential, but using that to figure out what they might mean and where and how they would really come out in a set of ideas. I think thinking innovatively is very important. Constantly drive yourself to say, if this is the problem, what are the solutions? No solution in one sense is the dramatic silver bullet. It often has to come through a lot of give and take. You should find that success in foreign policy is not the private preserve of a single individual, but of a great deal of grinding, pushing, shoving, and thinking. Failure, of course, tends to attach to individuals, and so the risk you take as a Foreign Service officer, an American diplomat, is if you fail, you'll become responsible for it. My own view is you need to be able to take the risk. And if you fail, that's fine. Your ability to get up off the ground and start again is what people will admire more than deprecate you for the fact that you may have lost. But my other feeling is that recognize this is a team sport, that individual exemplary athletes in diplomacy have all of the same problems in any team sport that individual athletes have. If they don't play together, if they don't learn from each other, and if they don't organize themselves to work as a team, they will be much less effective than the alternative, which is basically to do those cooperative things. And those are the things that I think that are out there that we should keep in mind and that are important.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much again, Master Pickering. It's been a pleasure to speak with you, learn from you, and I'm very grateful for this opportunity.
Thank you, Mariya, and I appreciate you coming by.
Thank you.